So, Jamie Metzl, all I know is that I read Hacking Darwin, and I heard you on Joe Rogan and podcasts, and I was determined to stalk and find you. And I'm so glad I did, because you are just one of the most incredible people of all time. And thank you for coming here.
Well, Norma, I've told you this story before, but not everybody knows it. Maybe nobody knows it. When you reached out to me and you said, "Hi, I'm Norma Kamali. I'm a fashion designer," as I responded to you, you were like a hero in my house in Kansas City growing up, because whenever it was, maybe in the 1970s when I was a little kid,
Right.
my mother and father came to New York. They went into your shop. My mother bought this beautiful purple sleeping bag coat, and the story, which was retold many times, is that Norma Kamali, she made it look so perfect, and it was so great. And my mother is 5'2", and then came back to Kansas City, and she couldn't quite figure out how to tie it exactly. And so literally every year, and I know that your whole thing is that your clothes should be useful for
Forever.
life. And
Yes.
so every year it was both worn for warmth, and I think it was part of 20 or 30 Halloween costumes. It was like something vampire in a Norma Kamali purple coat. So I was so happy to hear from you. And because of that history, I was fully aware, and I was just so excited to hear from you. And of course, since then, we've become friends.
Yes.
And my general view of life, as I was just telling you a moment ago, is every second and every day, if you're not reinventing yourself based on whatever inputs you're receiving, you're kind of dying.
Yeah.
And you are just, in my mind, the gold model of saying, all right, here's the starting point. Don't forget your history,
Right.
but where do we go? How do we learn more? How do we stay active and alive?
And you, my dear, are pretty much on the accelerated version of that. So I think just for everybody knows you, by the way. Everybody, wherever I go, when something comes up that is Jamie Metzl, genius, and by incredible people. But we may have a lot of women. May have a lot of women in fashion, music, and other industries. And I'm trying to kind of open conversations in other areas. First of all, you're a great looking guy, so everybody's going to want to know
You're
who
sweet
is
to
he?
say.
But tell everybody a little bit about your history, which is so very interesting, and will kind of frame your
Sure.
kind of background.
So maybe I'll start with kind of early history, prehistory for me, which is that my father and grandparents came to the United States as refugees after the war, fleeing Nazism in Europe. They'd been displaced persons in Switzerland for 10 years, were resettled to Kansas City by HIAS, which is the Jewish Refugee Agency, which is where I grew up. So that was always a big part of my identity, that history. And then when I was a freshman at Brown, I met a classmate of mine named Arn Chorn Pond, who was a Cambodian survivor of the killing fields, whose whole family had been killed. Really incredible guy. Actually, there was a film made about him. But at that time, he just told me his story, and I couldn't believe it, that I had this personal history, and here was someone who had been through this genocide in my lifetime. And at that time, nobody seemed to know much about it, so I became kind of obsessed. And then that summer after my freshman year at Brown, I went home to Kansas City, did a deal with my parents of cleaning out the whole house and selling all the crap in a garage sale, bought a ticket to Thailand, and I mean, it's kind of shocking to me now, made my way to a refugee camp as an 18-year-old kid and say, hey, how can I be helpful? So I ended up teaching refugees, and then I became in charge of overseeing curriculum development for this refugee school. I mean, advancement happens quickly, and then I became in charge of the school. So that was something that was very important to me. But as I spent more time both on the border, and then later I started doing my PhD at Oxford, but I left for 2 years to work for the UN in Cambodia. It became increasingly clear to me that all the things that we love to do, and whether it's fashion or writing books or whatever, it all exists within a framework that we can't always see, like a framework of justice and order and legal infrastructures. And when those things break down, which happened certainly with my father's family, it certainly happened in Cambodia, all these other things, all these amazing dreams that every person carries can't be realized.
Yeah.
And you look at what's happening now in Ukraine, where so much energy has to go into survival or fighting. So that was what inspired me to then, when I finished my PhD, and like I said, I worked for 2 years in Cambodia for the UN to go to law school. And following on that idea, I worked for 6 years in the United States government, on the White House for President Clinton, at the State Department for Madeleine Albright, and in the Senate for then chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Joe Biden. And then I left that, and I was writing books and doing things all along the way about my ideas on various things. And then I moved back to Kansas City and ran for United States Congress 20 years ago. That didn't work. I tried my best. And then since then, I was the executive vice president of Asia Society. I was a partner in a global private equity firm. But my big passion, which I've been working on very, very consistently, is thinking about and writing about the big picture implications of the revolutionary technologies that are transforming not just the world around us, but the world increasingly inside of us. And as somebody whose life has been driven by these questions of how can our best ideals be realized in context, it made me feel that now is the time we really need to be having these big questions about how do we ensure that our most sacred values guide the application of our most powerful technologies. And so just as a quick thing, as you know, I've written 5, and book number 6 is about to come out. The first book was a revision of my PhD dissertation, looking at the Cambodia genocide and why the world failed to respond. And then my first novel was set in the context of the Thai-Cambodian border after the Vietnam War. And then 2 near-term science fiction novels, Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata. And then my last book, which you mentioned, Hacking Darwin, and my new book, which is I'm just finishing the copy edits now, is called Superconvergence: Superconvergence, how the genetics, biotech, and AI revolutions will transform our lives, work, and world. And that's just looking at the big picture of what's coming, but the essence of it isn't just about the technology. It's about the values and how we should think about building a framework so that we're realizing our best aspirations with these technologies and avoiding bad things.
It's incredibly exciting. A lot of people are fearful, and change is hard, and change means good things happen and bad things happen. But the idea that all of the dreams that we have that we thought were impossible can actually happen. So I'm interviewing people who are AI, even my professor from MIT is doing one, and people who are entrenched in AI from Abu Dhabi. And but I love your perspective on everything. I really think you look at things in a very organized way. And I think that helps people to think about possibilities when they don't have to untangle a confused sort of dialogue that is made of words that most people aren't familiar with. To untangle a little bit of what you're looking at.
So, well, first I'll talk about the form, because I completely agree with you, and then I'll talk about the content. So in terms of form, I mean, there are a lot of really smart people on planet Earth who have a hard time communicating their very brilliant ideas to other people. And in my mind, I feel like that's kind of a waste, because my whole philosophy is that these big things are happening. They're happening on a planetary level, on a species-wide level. And we all need to be part of the process of figuring out how to manage these things and what comes next. So in my mind, the name of the game is bring people into the conversation with communicating things and complex things. I mean, everybody can absorb complexity, but it needs to be communicated in an accessible way. So my aspiration for my books and my other communications, but certainly for my books, is I want to have books with lots of really great information, but books where people are comfortable taking them to the beach.
Yeah.
Comfortable. They don't feel like it's like some kind of punishment, though. I know I'm supposed to learn about AI. I guess I better just punish myself for doing it. And then in terms of the content of the work, as I mentioned before, it's all along this same spectrum of describing these revolutionary technologies. And the reason why I use the word superconvergence is we have these shorthands that we use for ourselves of these different names for technology, like computer science and AI and genetics and biotech and nanotech. And when we say those things, it sounds like those are distinct things, but we really just have one thing that is technology. Mm-hmm. And all of these technologies are inspired by the other technologies and inspire the other technologies. They are embedded in those other technologies, and the other technologies are embedded in them. And just to give a very simple example, we had the computer science revolution, which made the AI revolution possible. And using our tools of AI and machine learning, we can interrogate biology in new ways. And biological designs obviously are incredible. Almost 4 billion years of evolution has figured out a lot of really tough things. And so now we're using biological designs to make faster computer chips that speed up our AI and machine learning, that unlock more secrets of biology that then get woven in. So it's like an accelerating cycle of technology, which is, it's really just one thing. And because of that acceleration, we have to almost retrain our minds, because our minds have developed to optimize practical thinking. That's how you survive in the savannas of Africa. It's not by dreaming. It's by saying, all right, where are the risks? Where do I get the food? What are the dangers? But now we live in a world where we almost have to suspend the practicality of our minds, because the way our minds are designed to work is to think that tomorrow will be kind of like yesterday. That's why when you open your refrigerator in the morning, you're not like bracing yourself, like what's going to happen here? You kind of just open it up because you remember what it looked like last night. But now we're in a world where things are changing so fast that to appreciate the speed of change, we all, myself included, almost need to recalibrate our brains. And that requires a lot of training. And you, Norma, as I said before, you're kind of the gold standard of this, because we can never stop. It's a process where we always need to be learning. I was giving a talk in Orange County last week, and at the end of the talk, I gave a prescription of what people can do. And one of the things that I said is you need to be spending 2 hours a day learning things other than your main line of work, like adjacent, whatever, following your curiosity. Because if you're just following your exact thing, you aren't going to understand all of the different influences that are weaving together.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I'm broadening what my podcasts are about. And medicine and, the speed of medicine and the development of new techniques, new ideas, stem cell. I had an incredible woman on who's at the forefront of stem cell and mind-blowing kind of progress, but it's the same speed that AI and all other technology. You're absolutely right. And I brought all of this into this conversation because it's exactly what you said. If you're only in your little kind of focus, not that it's little, I mean, the fashion industry is huge, the music industry is huge, all of these are big. It's so limiting. And I think everybody I meet that's not using ChatGPT, I say, start now. I mean, you by the time it's at 7, you're going to say, what the hell? I don't know what's going on. I'm not part of this. And I think the idea of not being part of something really just sort of closes the door of opportunity. So when you look at this speed, I mean, it is incredible. It's exciting and incredible, but it's like you can't close your eyes almost. You're just like, oh no, there's something else happened. What are you thinking of personally? Like, this is a personal experience, right? It's going to become more personal as big as it gets. It becomes more personal. People don't realize that. What can you kind of talk about in the personal aspect of this?
Sure. So let me say, if the first, just a quick reference to what you said about ChatGPT, which I totally agree with. And when people interact with ChatGPT the first time, they say, wow, this is really cool. I mean, everybody's blown away by it. And then the first thought, at least for people who have been exposed, it's like, wow, this is like Google search, but it's only cooler and smarter. And what I tell people is that's a great first impression. And then you need to take a step back and realize that it's wrong, or it's at least insufficient. If I asked you, Norma, how did electricity influence your day today? It would be impossible to answer the question. I mean, it goes from you slept last night, presumably with air conditioning. It's hot now in New York, and all of your clothes are manufactured. How you got to work, your coffee, the lighting that we're speaking with these microphones and these cameras. You just couldn't filter out electricity from your life. And that's certainly with AI and these other technologies. It's just going to be woven into every aspect of our life. Like you have these glasses. I don't know whether there's AI in these glasses now.
I wish they were.
But there certainly will be AI in the manufacture of plastic, in lenses, in all of these different things. But I think your second question is the most important question. If people think of these technologies as some other, and there's like me and technology, they're kind of missing the point. First, historically, like we live in a technology delineated world. Even the Unabomber, all of us live in this world. It's because of technology that we're as distributed as we are, that there are 8 billion of us because we have the technology of agriculture and industrial agriculture. And so a lot of people say, well, we hearken back to this ideal old age. There was no kind of ideal old age because before we were getting either hunted by these predators, we were killing all of the fauna. It's just
dying of bacterial
diseases, starving to death. I mean, it's like if you had to pick when in history to be alive, like now's the time. And so the first point that I would make is this is really personal, and it's. I'll give a very, very personal example. So while I was writing the healthcare chapter of my book, my father, who's now doing really, really well, 1 year ago, was diagnosed with neuroendocrine cancer, which is the Steve Jobs kind of cancer. And so I don't know why this is, everyone else in my family is a physician, but I was the person overseeing his healthcare. And so we have this wonderful doctor in Denver, and the first treatment was a kind of a standard chemotherapy, which is a standard first step for this kind of cancer. And he tolerated it well, but it didn't work all that well from the scans. And then we had to choose, well, what is the next step? And so this wonderful physician was recommending that we do the second line of chemotherapy, which had maybe a 30% chance of working, but 100% chance of some pretty harsh side effects. And there was a genetic targeted agent therapy that we sequenced my dad's regular cells and the cancer cells and identified a potential vulnerability in the cancer. And so what I pushed for and what we ended up doing was this targeted agent genetic therapy called a BRAF inhibitor. And it's worked incredibly well. And that drug had been approved by the FDA I think 3 weeks before my father took it for the first time. So it was like I was writing, and actually just yesterday I was working on the acknowledgments for my book, and I made the exact point that you did. A lot of this stuff is really scary, and there's people who are scared of these technologies are correct to be scared because there's a lot of scary things, a lot of bad things could happen. Maybe we'll get to it. I think some bad things have already happened, like the entire COVID-19 pandemic. But there are also some incredible stories. Like my father a year ago with his diagnosis, he was crying and saying, I just want to be there for his first granddaughter, Anna Rose's bat mitzvah.
Right.
And we're going to that bat mitzvah in 2 weeks. And then over New Year's, we're taking my father and mother on a Caribbean cruise, which is, it's not the most exciting cruise, but it's like, we're just going to stay on the boat, not get off, and enjoy ourselves.
It's just really, and the FDA is sort of like, how far are they going to go in holding things back, and what are they doing? And I was thinking, how did this happen without the FDA? And 3 weeks before, that's the universe jumping in for your father. It really is, sure.
and like the FDA has an important job because there's so much excitement, and you mentioned aging. Like there's so many people out there spinning tales. There's like real underlying science.
Right.
And there's mice who are living longer. And then there are people who are saying, my mice live longer, therefore, and just and it's great that we have an FDA. It's great that we have regulators, and we don't want to have AI algorithms running wild, or we don't want to have people doing systemic interventions that may or may not help or hurt. So I think that's why, in my view, all of these technologies, with all of their promise and all of their potential peril, they have to be regulated. They have to be governed in some way. And I think that we can't wait. It's not appropriate even for experts and government officials and scientists or whatever to be in charge of that. It's up to us, because these are, and that's coming back to your point about accessibility and readability, certainly on the genetic stuff. I mean, I lecture to the top scientists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and to the 7th and 8th graders of the Hebrew Academy of Bergen County, New Jersey, where my friend was chairman of the board. But everybody across that range gets, what are the challenges?
Yeah.
What about equity? What about diversity? Who decides? I mean, there are all these kind of really basic questions, and that's why podcasts like this are so important. That's why having communications with different kinds of people, because it's just like, as I mentioned, I'm originally from Kansas City. As I think everybody has now heard, Taylor Swift has her new boyfriend on the Kansas City Chiefs. So like a whole bunch of Taylor Swift people are learning about football, and a whole bunch of football people are learning about Taylor Swift.
And critically important.
Yeah, but I think we have to build these bridges.
And even more so now, where, I was just attributing political differences to the divide, but there's also the divide of the very wealthy and the very poor. And that is probably even more than the political divide, if you can even imagine that something could be more than the political divide. And the more we think about things, whether it's healthcare or some of the things AI can do to narrow that gap, just to change education, just to change healthcare, what do? Well, certainly any of the inequities that we are aware of, whether it's racism in the way we educate our children, or how we provide health care globally, where everybody is able to have preventative, proactive approaches to their health that does not have to include emergency operations, or like you're doing something, whether it's stem cell proactively for your children to be, that they're on it, they're ahead of it. Those kinds of things have to happen, and we're at the doorstep. And that's really the beauty of the world we're going into. So in the fear side.
Can we pause on that? Because I think it's such an important point. You're absolutely right. We have these terrible divisions in the world. They're not just, frankly, bad for the poor people. They're bad for everybody. It makes our societies unstable. And so on the plus side, these technologies have the ability to, some of the poorest people in the world can have access to like a digital healthcare provider, which at least is better than the nothing that many people have. You may not have access to quality education, but through Khan Academy and these other entities that are kind of figuring out how to do remote education. But what I will say is these technologies are kind of value agnostic. The technologies don't come with their own built-in value system. They can be used in ways that increase the divisions, that weaken some people, or they can be used in ways that strengthen all of us and certainly empower the most disadvantaged. And that's why everything comes back to values. Everything comes back to say, well, what are the decisions that we're making today? And there's a bit of a paradox in that right now people are getting that something big is happening, and some people like you get that point a little earlier, and some people get it a little bit later. But the earlier anybody recognizes that something big is happening, the greater their potential impact, because like every system, once it gets rolling, it gets harder and harder to change.
Yeah, it does. It's catching up, and then not feeling a part of it is just devastating. And it's amazing how many people, young people, who are sort of not taking it seriously in some way. What do you think? What is your point of view about the approach we will have to take for the guardrails, for protections, for sort of not policing, but sort of monitoring and having sort of I picture these sort of flying monkeys protecting, that world of what could be, and zapping any of the bad stuff.
Well,
it's all a comedy.
I'm from
mind.
Kansas City. When I hear flying monkeys, I think of the Wizard of Oz, and the monkeys were the bad guys. So the way I kind of think about what you're describing is the broad term of governance. And so when people think about governance, they think, oh, that must be what governments do. And that's in part the case, but it's really what we all do. And it's kind of how do we think about anything, any technology? Like, what are the guardrails? How do we decide? And it has to really happen on every level. I'll pick AI because it's one that a lot of people are thinking about. There are some people who say, well, this is so exciting. There are all these great companies and they're all doing things. Why don't they just do what they want and let this play out? Well, we had this experience with high containment virology labs of kind of doing what they want in China, and now 20 million people are dead from a totally avoidable pandemic. And you could easily imagine even one dangerous algorithm escaping and infecting the world. So we have to have governance. There are people like Elon Musk who called for this 6-month moratorium on new versions equivalent to the next phase of ChatGPT, which I didn't support, and I didn't support him in that call because there was no plan on what would happen in those 6 months, other than Elon Musk speeding up his development of an alternative AI company. And so we really need to think of governance at every level. And it's a big task at every level, certainly on a sense of personal responsibility, this personal ethics codes of what do we want to do, not want to do. In our companies, what are standards of behavior and practice? What are systems within industries for self-regulation? For governments, what are best practices for the governance and regulation of these technologies? And some countries and entities are doing better than others, and right now there are these different experiments. The European Union is trying to have for AI its risk-based governance, so higher risk stuff gets governed and regulated more than lower risk stuff. But because this is a global issue, and because our networks are connected to each other, you could have the greatest regulation in the world in your country, but if you're connected to networks from other places, and they are the weak link. And so that's also why we need to think globally. I didn't mention before, but I'm also founder of a global social movement called One Shared World. And the idea behind One Shared World, which we created in the early days of the pandemic, is that, at least as I see it, the greatest problem that we have in our world is the mismatch between the nature of the greatest challenges we face, which are global and common, and the absence of a sufficient framework for addressing that entire category of problems. It's also called the global collective action problem. And so we have like issues like climate change, like pandemics, proliferating weapons of mass destruction, AI governance. These are all individual issues that can't be solved individually, but we don't have that bigger framework. So while we focus, as we must, on these what I call verticals, we have to look at that horizontal issue of governance. And it's really challenging because in the past, we've had quantum leaps in how our world is organized. In the 17th centuries, there was the 30 Years' War that culminated in the various pieces, or the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, that kind of enshrined the concept of the modern nation state. And then these modern nation states became so competitive with each other that we had 2 world wars. And then in 1945, we had the UN Charter, which says, well, there needs to be this overlay of the international monetary system and the UN. And now we're at another one of these moments where the global governance systems aren't up to the task of meeting our needs.
Yeah.
And I know we're going to address that problem. There's maybe a 99% chance we'll address it because something will go horribly wrong.
Yeah.
And then we'll say we should have done it.
Yeah.
And there's a 1% or maybe less, and that's what I'm shooting for, that there can be some kind of collective consciousness, collective movement to say, hey, how far can we go now? And maybe it'll be simple things like, we need a stronger World Health Organization. We need a meaningful global governance body talking about revolutionary technologies like AI. I mean, it's not just abstract. We need to figure out what are some really specific nodes.
Well, I mean, that's hugely challenging. And I would have thought, and I did for a minute, that a global pandemic would force that we would realize how vulnerable we all were during that period of time. And during that period, there were so many different point of views on how to handle the pandemic, and there wasn't a unified kind of understanding of what was happening, how we were being affected by it, and an agreement globally on research and findings by the most informed, intelligent people. And so that was disappointing that we didn't rise above, because usually things like that change us and bring us right back to, okay, we need to think straight and not think critically.
Yeah, I, as you know, totally agree. And I remember when you and we did a video call in the earlier days of the pandemic, and you and I think both had the same thing. It's like, all right, this is my moment. I may be home. I'm going to rally. I'm going to do all of these things. Yeah. And I think there was this hope, and certainly there was a lot that was happening, but that could be like a seed or a spark or whatever the metaphor. And unfortunately, now that life is kind of going back to relative normal, I think people just, it's hard. I mean, it's hard. Life is hard for many people, and to kind of live life and to renegotiate the superstructure of life around you is really hard. It really takes a lot of energy. And so that's my fear, is that we kind of have these crisis moments and we rally a little and then we come back.
AI is actually bigger than all of it. What's happening in healthcare and medicine and surveillance and security in every aspect of our lives. So I think the more people know about the potential of AI, the highs and the lows and the risks, I think and I think that's why I want to communicate as much, so that everybody starts to get engaged in communication for a higher level of sort of existence. And
I think it's so great, and I completely agree. There's a French philosopher who did a calculation of just based on the benefits that we have from industrialization and all the resources around us, what is the number of slaves? Like if we didn't have electricity and industrialization, like how many, what is all that benefit equivalent? And he came up with this number. I don't know where he got it, but it's like we each have 150 slaves just for doing the things we want, preparing our food and whatever. And one way of thinking about these technologies is that we now have co-pilots for every aspect of our lives. So computer programmers have co-pilots even now over the last year. For people using these programs, they can code 50% faster. We're getting to a place where the AI systems may be able to code on their own. Anybody with the work you're doing in fashion, everywhere there are these accelerators. And like I said before, the AI, it's not going to provide us with answers, but it will empower us for better and for worse. And so for people who have a vision of the better, now is the time to kind of say, well, what are the different co-pilots? And some of the co-pilots are technologies, and some of the different co-pilots are people and building alliances and building communities. And so Garry Kasparov is the champion of this idea, which he got from chess, that the future doesn't belong to humans. It doesn't belong to AI. The future is humans plus AI. And in a healthcare perspective, if 10 years from now you go see a physician and the physician treats you unassisted by AI, that will be malpractice. But if really,
No, I agree.
And if you go and see an AI physician and there's not a human somewhere in the loop, that will probably be malpractice too. But the name of the game will be humans and AIs working together. And we're going to have to figure out, well, what are the things? What is core human? Is it creativity? Is it kindness? Is it compassion? Is it different ways of thinking, different ways of community building? And in those things, we need to double down on the great human stuff. And what are things that AI do better than we do? I mean, right now, like when pocket calculators were first introduced, people said, well, this is going to ruin math. But now anybody who's doing math has the calculator with them. And so the calculator is part of our mathematical brain. And these AI systems will be part of our brains and our hearts and our lives.
But the thing that I really stress is AI is not a creative soul with a heartbeat. It creates as an extension of what we give it. And so if you're an original thinker, that is, that's beyond that technology. If the technology can take it and use it and expand on it, but it's probably not going to be an innovative thinker without being fed some data or some information.
And certainly from where we are now, the thought of an AI having the creativity like you have, and not just a creativity once, but a creativity of reinvention. I absolutely agree with you. But maybe here's just it's not counterexamples, it's just additional information. I live on the Upper East Side. If I go to the Met Museum and I spend the day walking around the Met, and then I come home and I paint a painting, will my painting be 0.2% influenced by Degas and Manet and seeing this wonderful exhibit? I don't know. And how will I even know that? And I'll be painting with paints, and there's like a whole history of oil paints and acrylic paints, and I'll have concepts of organization, and whether it's abstract expressionism, where let's say I do like really bad amateurish painting, but let's say I was even any good. So it's not like I came up with abstract expressionist painting. It's like, well, I'm thanking Kandinsky, even if I'm someone who's never heard of Kandinsky. So we live in these contexts, and even what we call creativity exists within a social and cultural context which has a history. That's my point one. And then point number two, in 2006, the company DeepMind, and now Google DeepMind, they had their algorithm called AlphaGo, and it was an early, relative to today, algorithm designed to play the game of Go, which is much more complex in terms of the numbers of possible moves. than chess. And so the idea before that was, well, chess was the easy one because you could just do raw power computing, but Go was going to take decades. And they had this AI system, and it played the world champion Lee Sedol in Seoul 4 games out of 5, and AlphaGo, won 4 games out of 5. But there was one move that AlphaGo made that all of these human grand champions who were watching it would say, they said, now AlphaGo really screwed up. We showed that human thinking was greater. And it turned out, now this move is called the God move, because it was this genius move that no humans in the thousands of years of Go had come up with. And so I just don't know about that issue of creativity, because I don't know if we know exactly what creativity and what's the boundary between each of our individual creativity and the social context in which we live.
The social context is very important, but you're absolutely right, because, with AI, or ChatGPT, you can put in a few words, and then the natural next word comes, the natural next word. And so that is a continuation. And literally there are many designers who see a collection that they really love, and their natural next collection has an influence of it. And it could be, for me, I'm very influenced by a number of things. It could be the social condition. Right. It could be a pandemic. It could be how I feel about love. Right. And so all of these social conditions, plus my creative sort of intuition with all of that, is just a sum total of every experience I've had. But maybe... and it's not so different, because it's taking all of those the way AI does and sort of churning it up and spitting out something that's never been seen before. But I do think the physical experience that we have, the tactile experience, you can describe how this feels. Yeah. You can describe this feeling about another person. You can do all of that, but there's something that we initiate through the physical form that can make it different.
100%. I totally agree. Like you and I, we just touched hands. Our microbiome, like your microbiome jumped to me and my microbiome jumped to you. And so humans, we have equal number of cells, which are human cells, and the microbiota that are living with us and part of us. So we just had this physical experience. What our brains are doing is not disembodied. It's connected to all of our senses. And that's why, for me, I don't like to use the word artificial intelligence. I think it's just an alternative form of intelligence. Like when we interact with a dog or a dolphin, we don't call that dog or a dolphin like a dumb human or an artificial intelligence. It's a dog intelligence. It's a dolphin intelligence. And I think that what we're doing now is we're creating an alternative form of intelligence. And then, as a matter of fact, I think that's the big story of the 21st century for our species, is human engineered intelligence and human re-engineered biology. But humans, I mean, depending on your theology, but I certainly don't believe humans are like some microprocessor with with a carriage mechanism. Like our brains are, whatever people believe, spirits or souls or whatever, are deeply connected to our physicality. So our intelligence is just a different thing. And just like we have coexisted with other intelligent entities, including other humans like the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, other animals, I just think increasingly we are going to be coexisting with this human-created alternative intelligence. And it's going to have profound implications.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, education is such a big priority in our global existence. If we have intelligence, we will do better things for the planet, for each other. We won't mock each other. We won't hurt each other. We won't kill each other. We'll be more informed about each other, and the more we know about each other, the more we can have compassion and concern. And I do feel, and I know I'm an optimist about everything, but I do feel that if more people, children especially, have access to endless information and can use it in a good way, like good, some sort of pristine information, that the idea of hating each other and having conflicts with each other, whether, again, it's just political differences or, I don't eat ice cream, you like stupid things, but just having that, the feeling about the human species should rise to a higher level. Am I being a total fool in this belief?
I would never, I love you so much, I would never call you a total fool. And there we just exchange more microbiota. Here's the challenge of that. And I talked about my personal history. If you had asked 100 years ago, what's the high point civilization of education and culture, it would have been Germany or Austria, where my father and grandparents were. And that didn't seem to be a protection. And I just feel that with humans, we are so easily swayed into these us or them frameworks. 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, in the just after the 1900s, there was this idea with the telegraph. There was actually a book by Norman Angell that said, now that we're connected with the telegraph, there will be no war. And there was that whole period, that first phase of globalization, which came to a crashing halt with World War I. And so, as I was saying before, I wish that there was some kind of built-in kind of magical spirits in these technologies. But these technologies can equally be potentially used for good or for ill, to unite us or to divide us. But certainly there is this opportunity. There is this potential of really coming together, and with education, with common understanding. You look at all these young people who are involved in the climate action movement around the globe, who are coming together, and all sorts of things. So I think that's the hope. And I think the world, I'm an optimist too, the world runs on optimism. If you said the world sucks, we're going to hell, you're going to have to believe. Tomorrow, and then the quote that one of my favorite quotes since I was a kid, it's actually in my new book, a Thoreau quote: "If you've built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now build the foundations under them." So it's great to dream and then build.
So now, right now, so many people say all the news we hear is propaganda. Everything we hear is some sort of a plan for this side or the other side to convince the populace that what they're doing is for the good of mankind, for the good of the country, for the good. And so we want to believe that. We want to have confidence in leadership or in companies that are supposedly creating products for the good of mankind. You can go through lots of layers here. So I think when the fear of AI comes around, it's really, is this going to be an extension of what we are already not feeling so good about, where people we want to trust maybe are not that trustworthy, whether they're making something for us to eat or drink or medication or safety, or governments doing things that we don't know, we can't trust. There's so much of that disbelief and concern that it's easy to understand the fear that people may have about AI. So what are your thoughts? What is going to be the solution?
Yeah.
Or
I don't know if I have a solution, but I agree with you. There's a real danger because, again, we shouldn't hark back to some kind of idealized past, but there certainly was a time, certainly in this country, maybe the 1950s and 60s, where there were relatively few sources of relatively trusted information. And people had Walter Cronkite or whatever, and everyone was kind of doing the same thing. And since then, we've decentralized and disaggregated. So right now we have all different kinds of entities with different levels of accountability. So just some of the stuff that I'm working on, where I'll be interacting with journalists, say from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and they'll have one standard of what it will take to make an assertion in one of those media. But then there are these other people who have Substack blogs, and their business model is readers and excitement. So those guys have a much lower evidentiary standard. We have trusted people. Like I was just reading something about Tom Hanks, and there was like an AI version of Tom Hanks that looked exactly like him. I think it was being used to sell soap or doing something. He said, I'm not part of this. And so that is a really huge issue because our bodies, you talking about just our physicality of humans, we are built to make these very snap decisions about trust. Do I trust this person? Do I trust this food? Because that's the only way we can negotiate. And right now, these systems are becoming as sophisticated in many ways as our brain. Just to use another example. So I don't know, I'm sure you've done the VR goggles.
Yeah.
And even when you're, like I did a thing I think it was at South by Southwest, where you go and you're just in a room like this, and you see people with these glasses, and they're screaming and yelling and falling, and you think, well, I'm going to do it now, and I'm going to remember that I'm in this room and I'm not falling, so I'm just going to stand there and I'm going to show them how tough I am.
Right.
So they put on these glasses, and it's just like a cartoon, but in the cartoon, you're kind of going up in like one of those window washers, external elevators in a high rise, and then you're on the top, and then like the floor is breaking under, and you have to walk across this wooden plank to get to the other side, and then you're walking, and then that wooden thing starts to break, and you're trying to tell yourself, this isn't real, I'm in a room, and you just cannot, because your brain is designed faster than your consciousness to take in information. And that's just how we are. And so all this stuff that's coming at us, we're not that well organized to defend against, especially these kinds of AI and other systems who have processing in certain ways that's faster than ours. And so you can imagine like a VR glasses with the exact pixelation of life, where it's not even a cartoon. It looks exactly the same. And how are we going to differentiate? And that's why I think there's the governance and governments must play a role, because if we just say, oh, this is all about the free market, it will be leaving everybody vulnerable to the worst actors.
No, I love VR, and I was in a Syrian town that was being bombed with my AI glasses, and there was a baby who was crying, a little kid, a little tiny 2-3-year-old crying, caught in the rubble, and I had to walk across the board, and there was burning flames, and I was sweating, and my heart was racing, and I had to save that baby. It was like, help, help, help. And I'm like so in the moment, and I thought, oh my God, that really was an extraordinary manipulation of my senses, my sense of right and wrong, my feelings, every aspect of me. I willingly did it, but there are these questions like, will we unwillingly or unwittingly know whether or not that Syrian town really was being bombed and that baby was really there, and I'm risking my life, so to speak, emotionally and spiritually. And so I think that we would assume that whether it's the hierarchy in AI and Elon Musk and all of the people that have really been a big part of this, that they are working very hard, I would assume, on finding the inequities, who's a bad actor, why are they doing it, how they detect it is the question.
Well, I think it's an open question. I mean, you mentioned Elon Musk, but others, I mean, I don't think it's the case that every business whose business is our attention is in the business of protecting us from things that we want to focus on, even unconsciously. Right. I mean, Elon Musk has taken many of the filters off of, I'll call it Twitter, because it was getting in the way of engagement. And so you're familiar with the conflict between Elon Musk and the Anti-Defamation League, where Twitter, in my view, appropriately was suppressing hate speech. And then the filters got taken away, and not surprisingly, it ramped up. So it's not the case that every company is incentivized to protect us based on some kind of principles. And I feel like if we want to have those principles, we have to start at least a process of saying, well, what are they? What are the measures of accountability? What are the structures that can incentivize that accountability? Because we're going to be in these systems, and I'll use, again, Twitter. Like, I'm a very active Twitter user. It took me a long time to get the number of followers, which I have, which is obviously a lot less than other people. And so I'm kind of in. And in Twitter, there's a reward mechanism, and I have different things that I tweet about. So I'm, as I mentioned before, very active on the issue of COVID origins. I just think it's outrageous that we had this, in my view, totally avoidable pandemic. 20 million people are dead. There's no transparency, no accountability, and China is preventing any meaningful investigation.
Well,
yeah.
Let's cover that.
But let me just finish this point, and then we can. So when I tweet, like, it is outrageous that we have no investigation of COVID-19 origins without transparency and accountability now. There's no chance we'll have it in the future. I'll get tons of engagement and tons of support. I mentioned I'm the founder of One Shared World. If I say we need to come together in a spirit of love to solve our greatest challenges together, it's like 3 people, and one of them's my mom.
Right.
And I think that's the thing. We have all these incentives around us. Some are conscious, some are unconscious.
It's like the alerts on the news channels. This is, alert. So you have been speaking out with real passion about your feelings about COVID, and quite frankly, under a lot of criticism, and really with documentation and data. And what's happened recently seems to be sort of a vindication of everything you've been saying. And I think now, right in my office here, we're having a wave of COVID again. And I'm thinking, okay, we're going to test to make sure we're not spreading each other, and whoever wants to wear a mask if it's helpful. But I really don't know what to think. I'm a bit confused. There are different vaccines, and we all have different immune systems, and we're all individuals. And here's where AI could step in and tell us at what point we should be paying attention and taking steps. I think this is a perfect AI opportunity to test us and tell us. But why don't you, and of course this will be controversial, there'll still be people who think that your point of view and opinion, first of all, is based on some knowledge and some experience. So just, first of all, a little background on why you have this point of view.
So I'll separate out the two things. One on the vaccines, and then second on the origins. On the vaccines, I am actually a huge believer in the COVID vaccines. I think the COVID mRNA vaccines are miracles of science. Billions of people have been vaccinated, and they've proven to be remarkably safe. That doesn't mean there aren't individual cases, and I absolutely agree. Agreeing with the Dr. Paul Offit in Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and others, that just to say that everybody is exactly the same is kind of a mistake. And that was the public health messaging, because people felt we didn't have the capacity for this nuance. And it was like, if the choice was everybody get vaccinated or some kind of confusing message that people couldn't internalize, I think they decide, well, let's just say everybody get vaccinated. And I think they're remarkably safe. I actually went yesterday to get my COVID booster, but they ran out at the CVS on the Upper East Side. So I'm going back next week. So I'm a huge believer in vaccines. And I'll just say, just to set up what I'm going to say about origins, I'm a huge believer in vaccines. I believe that climate change is real and humans are drivers of it. I believe that a lone gunman killed JFK. I believe that Britney Spears can do whatever she wants, but frankly, having her dad in the mix may actually be helpful to her. So I haven't been part of any really conspiracies. Right. But in the earliest days of the pandemic, when I was looking at the evidence, I was hearing these stories in the news, and saying that the pandemic started from this Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. And I was already, it didn't sound right to me because I'd just been in Wuhan for something else. And so I knew, I lived in Cambodia, and I know what a market looks like in Cambodia. And it's kind of what people are imagining, one of these crazy wild animal markets. And I've been in Wuhan, which is a highly sophisticated, wealthy, educated city where they look down on these people in southern China who have those dietary habits. So my first thought was, well, that's kind of weird. They don't have the kind of markets that people are imagining in Wuhan. And then in late January, I saw a report in The Lancet, the British medical journal, which showed that more than a third of the first people known to be infected with COVID-19 in Wuhan had no exposures to the Huanan seafood market. So that made it seem pretty clear to me that the market was a place where a super spreader place, but not the origin. And then I just kept seeing these stories. Oh, it comes from the market. And it just didn't make sense to me. So I really became obsessed. And then in February of 2020, I went to South Africa for the meetings. I didn't mention before, but I was a member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. So I went to Cape Town for those meetings. And I thought, I'm just going to present my case to my colleagues, the super smart people, brilliant scientists and regulators and others. And hopefully they'll tell me why I'm wrong, because it's not like I'm a stakeholder in it coming from a lab accident or something. I just want to get to the bottom of it. And to my surprise, they said, hey, we think you're onto something. I mean, it was privately they said that. And so I came back and I kept digging. And the more I dug, the more I knew that they had these level 4 virology institutes, very quickly learned about the research that they were doing, genetically engineering exactly these kinds of viruses and exactly the ways that could potentially lead to the SARS-CoV-2 being as it was and where it was, more than 1,000 miles away from the natural habitat of these horseshoe bats who are the ancestral hosts. And so I just started speaking up. I launched a website in April of 2020, which got a lot of attention. I started to be called the original COVID-19 whistleblower. And then a friend of mine actually in the National Security Council for President Trump, the U.S. government didn't have any documentation on the origin. So he was sending around my website within the U.S. government, sending it to allied governments. So it just, and then I became part of a group of international experts, unofficially called the Paris Group. And then I was the lead witness in the congressional hearings on COVID-19. It's like one of those things where it's like deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. But it's really sad for me. I mean, it's 3.5 years on. China has destroyed samples, hidden records, imprisoned Chinese citizen journalists for asking basic questions. They have a gag order preventing Chinese scientists from saying anything public or writing anything public on pandemic origins. They've blocked any meaningful international investigation. It's just outrageous. And if you accept the Economist excess death figures, 20 million people are dead. So I'm just kind of determined just to keep at it for as long as it takes, and we'll see where it goes.
You know, it's interesting because it was such a huge event, that to believe what you're saying is a huge problem that I don't think anybody knows how to address. Like, what do you do?
Yeah,
there are these horrible events in our world history as a global history that are just devastating. But if you take these numbers and you put them in perspective, I don't think anybody can really deal with it. So I think it's easier to put it aside. And so typically I think someone like you, who's very credible, who comes to the front with, wait a minute, this just doesn't seem possible, and we're all sneezing and coughing and feeling crappy and afraid, to believe what you're saying. And I'm sure more and more people are thinking, holy crap, what did he say? Is so overwhelming. Even as you're saying it, I'm thinking, there's nothing bigger than this.
That's the way.
There's nothing bigger, and that's why you're saying, why the
face
hell isn't somebody listening? So we deal with not letting this happen again.
Exactly. Like, my feeling is we have to face it. I'm not saying this was intentional by the Chinese government. What I actually think they were doing, I think they were doing secret research to develop a pan-coronavirus vaccine. They had an accident. They didn't realize what it was. And by the time the national authorities realized what had happened, they had a choice. Either you say, hey, we had an accident, and it was a mistake, and we want to be totally open and transparent. And the second that happens, every local official says, oh, we have the new instructions from Beijing. We're open and transparent. The government gets overthrown in 2 seconds, because the entire point of the government is lying and obfuscation, starting with Mao, responsible for the deaths of 47 million Chinese people. Or you do what the Chinese Communist Party has done. They suppressed the crimes of Mao when the first speed train crashed and all these people died. They dug a hole and they threw the train in and covered it up. And at that time, there was an outcry, and the Chinese local people demanded they dig up the train. So that was their instinct. But if this exact same fact pattern happens again, and you're a Chinese official, you would be committing treason to be open and transparent about it, because you already have the game plan for SARS-1 and SARS-2, where you lied and obfuscated and covered up. And then there was no accountability. So the way I say it, as I said before, if we don't have openness and transparency now, there is no possible way we can have openness and transparency in the future.
So I'm just curious if in fact they were researching this exact virus, was it to find a solution in case a virus like this would be, was their ultimate goal of a higher mind to?
So I think so. I mean, it's just conjecture, but we know that as a result of increasing numbers of humans and deforestation and globalization and increasing interactions between animals and humans, the frequency of pandemics is increasing. So we're getting more and more pandemics. We know already, and this was an agreed consensus, that this class of viruses called coronaviruses, which now everybody knows about, were among the biggest dangers. And then there was this idea, well, we can wait, and for each individual coronavirus, we can work to develop a specific vaccine. And the mRNA vaccines were done very, very quickly. But before that, people thought it may take 4 to 10 years, if ever, to get a vaccine. And so the idea that a lot of people were working on is just like people are trying to develop a universal flu vaccine that protects us against all flu viruses, because now the flu shots, like the one that I had yesterday, what they're doing is anticipating what the flu season may look like based on what was happening 6 months ago in Australia generally. So if we had a universal flu vaccine, it says, well, what's common to all of these different flu viruses, and let's have a vaccine protecting us against that. So the idea of a universal coronavirus vaccine would be, well, what's common to all of these different coronaviruses, and can we have one vaccine that protects us against it? So I think that's what they were doing. And I think that in that process, they were essentially trying to engineer scarier viruses. And there are two ways of doing that. One is through a thing called serial passage, where it's just like pushed evolution, just like we had wolves and we kind of turned them into chihuahuas. And just with each generation, you say, like, all right, I'm selecting for whatever the criteria. And so you can just, using generations of viruses exposed to animals or animal cells, to say, all right, we're selecting for virulence, we're selecting for whatever, or genetic alterations using these new tools that we've just talked about of the genetics and biotech revolutions, which is also totally possible. We know that they were actually doing that research. We know that in 2018, there was a funding proposal, which was a New York-based organization called EcoHealth Alliance and the University of North Carolina and the Wuhan Institute of Virology and others. And the application to the U.S. Defense Department was for $14 million to genetically engineer SARS coronaviruses by adding human-specific spike proteins, and exactly what SARS-CoV-2 would be. And the grant wasn't funded, but it is totally common practice around the world that you apply for work that you've already done, and then you get funding and you kind of use it for the next thing.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that this kind of thing is still going on, because if we don't do it, then we're surprised by something and unprepared. I mean, I also think it was impressive that we were able to move so quickly.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
And that's kind of this ironic thing, is that, I mean, I obviously am not but I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump. But if Donald Trump did one great thing, it was this Operation Warp Speed. I mean, that was like historically unprecedented. But by the time these, in my view, miraculous vaccines came out, the anti-vax movement was so strong, they had to kind of distance themselves from that great success. And so, but we're just coming back to what you were saying, like, we want virologists and epidemiologists doing their best work. And it's very difficult to find the right balance, and whether that is the case for viruses. And I know there's this big debate of gain-of-function research, but there's a lot of things that are viruses that benefit us, like used in gene therapies that are saving people's lives, that could be classified as gain-of-function. So we don't want to throw it's a cliche, the baby out with the bathwater.
It's a tricky.
But here's another question, just coming out of virology and into AI. So assume that you or somebody is the defense minister of a country, and it could be the United States, China, Russia, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, just pick anybody. And you have a choice. If you do invest in autonomous killer robots, you will put the world at risk, because there's a chance that we're not going to be able over time to control these killing machines. But if you don't, it's almost guaranteed that you will lose your next war with the other guy. And so what do you do? And that's why, I mean, maybe the answer is global governance,
Yeah.
but it's really hard when we have all these different civil wars. I mean, now in Nagorno-Karabakh, you have these Armenians who are fleeing ethnic cleansing in their minds committed by the descendants of the people who committed the genocide 100 years ago. And you and in Ukraine, you have these people who feel like their country is being raped, and they are under pressure to defend themselves with whatever means they have. So it's really, really difficult because we have these different pressures on us as humans.
And the cycles of injustices, I mean, you can just keep going and going back in history in one country and see this happened and this happened and this happened. So the question is, do we just look at today and what's happening today? Do we look back at the injustices? I mean, my family is from the Middle East, and there's, it's a tribal society, and there are so many stories that do we keep telling those stories and being angry about them? Or do we look at today and tomorrow? I do want to say my optimistic side thinks that AI is going to give us the opportunity to look at things in a fresh way and maybe feel so good about the personalization of healthcare, the personalization of learning, personalization of interactions with the world, that maybe we'll feel so good about these advances that are taking our lives to much longer, healthier, productive times, to being part of a global society that has more positive opportunities. Maybe we will less look back in a sort of tribal way and be more advanced because we are more advanced.
Well, it's certainly one possibility, but if we want that to be the case, we're going to have to build it. I loved your example of the VR of going into that Syrian village, because on one hand, as you mentioned, you were afraid, well, am I being manipulated? On the other hand, I think it sounds like it gave you a level of empathy of like, what that must that be like to really understand that. And I do think that, we all, by definition, live with an ignorance of our history, because it's just like, everybody is here. Every single living entity has a 3.8 billion year history, and no one's thinking, oh my God, I used to be a little worm 600 years ago. And like, maybe you think about your parents.
Right.
But I do think that that we must. I mean, I have my PhDs in history, so maybe I'm a little biased, but there's no stable future that just starts today. Like we have to interrogate our history. We have to ask ourselves tough questions. We have to ask these questions about justice and accountability and history, because the Italian futurists, I mean, you actually have an outfit, looks like it could have been designed for one. 100 years ago. I mean, that's what they were about. Like, this is all the age of technology and that industrialization. You forget this past. But we humans, coming back to your point about being embodied humans, our bodies, our cells are time capsules, and they are carrying all of this history. And it's not just the mate selection of our ancestors. It's everything. It's the starvation of our species. 8% of our genome is viruses that have merged into us. It looks like our mitochondria, which are in nearly all of our cells, are bacteria, descendants of bacteria that were floating around on the bottom of the ocean. So we are these embodied time capsules. And I do think that understanding that history and having empathy for each other is part of that process of coming together.
Yeah, I agree. We can't not have history, because you and I have a history. We have history with friends and people we know in this lifetime, but then we have an ancestral history, and we have a history that is part of how we behave today and what we do. But what I think is this new phase will give us more of an intelligence about how we behave now, and maybe look at the history for lessons, but that behavior is course corrected because we are in a higher plane.
But what I would say just on that, sorry to interrupt, is it's that word will. It's the same point I made before. I would replace will in that sentence with could. It could have that, and I'm an optimist too. It could have that very positive outcome, which I hope it will, and it could have a terrible outcome pitting us against each other.
Yeah.
And that's why, in my mind, everything, it just comes back over and over and over to values. So if we want to have that vision that you've articulated, which I certainly do, well, how do we build it? What are the building blocks that increase the odds of that good story and decrease the odds of a different story?
So one of the things that I was having a conversation with some people who were talking about guardrails, talking about, well, how will we be protected? I mean, what could possibly be the surveillance of this? And I thought, well, maybe it's AI. Maybe we have the AI police or the AI whatever, and we have AI detecting when something is off. Like, it's totally not emotional.
Yeah.
It's totally based on data. And the AI police, that's a bad word, but the AI whatever, then can just beep.
It's like a hall monitor, or like a dance monitor in high school in the 1950s or something. Like, oh, don't touch there. So it could be there's a whole movement called constitutional AI, which is about this idea of having a whole set of rules. And there's a whole field of people saying, well, can we develop AI algorithms to police other AI algorithms within a context of a set of rules?
And
so it's, I mean, nobody knows the answer, but people are trying to develop these kinds of systems. And the problem with these kinds of enforcement mechanisms, because there are some societies that are trying to build that, like what you've just described, with a different set of values, is what China is actually trying to build. I mean, they're trying to deploy technology to just essentially influence the way people think, the range of possible outcomes, in a way that they, meaning the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, think is at very least in their interest, whether it's good or not. I've traveled extensively in North Korea. In North Korea, they have a system where everything is designed to incentivize what the government want and massively disincentivize. And coming to your point about having this kind of AI system, well, we would have to agree on what the goals are. And I'm kind of a philosopher who I really like is Isaiah Berlin, and one of his core philosophies is that the idea of one absolute truth that anybody can possess is actually a driver of instability. That it's when we recognize that we each have our own different truths. And I don't have an answer of how do we balance that? How do we balance this cacophony of everybody in the world having their own truth and their own fact set and their own sense of reality and justice and injustice, and the need for 8 billion, coming on 10 billion of us to kind of live together with some common set of norms. We have that in a country like the United States. I think we've all, in this immigrant society like New York, we've kind of internalized, well, there's a set of principles that maybe none of us invented on our own, but we kind of haven't, and I think that's good. Humans are, we're social beings.
Right. And the diversity is perfect. It's what we love. But I think when I'm thinking about these school monitors, hall monitors, the monitor would say, oh, Jamie Metzl never said that. This is a distort. This is this is not like what he said.
I don't know which Woody Allen movie it is where they're talking in front of the movie theater and they're talking about Marshall McLuhan, and Marshall McLuhan, I never said that.
Yes, no, I know. But that kind of protection, like that's not an authentic statement. Where that kind of thing, or we were, in the fashion industry, we have no protections. You can trademark, you can try to protect, but basically.
I'm very possessive. Whenever I see anybody with one of these big puffy jackets, like,
Well,
my friend Norma made that.
Well, but the point is, there's nothing that can be protected, but there are certain parts of the industry, shoe and handbag, that are more protected. And even if it looks similar but doesn't, in my industry, if somebody changes the size of the collar, it's different. But in handbag and shoes, it's a little bit less defined like that. And if you were to look at it and you thought they look similar, that would be enough legally. It's a little stretch on that, but that's what it is. So I was thinking, well, if AI could, in fact, make the determination that something was close enough and that I would get alerted, or you would get alerted, somebody just wrote a book just like yours, enough like yours for you to know about it, and that we automatically have a license fee that they pay, or they have to pay a fine. And I think that kind of thing is really what.
And I think it's starting to happen. I mean, I get letters like on my jamiemetzl.com website. When we were creating it, I just gave my designer some ideas of, like, let's have a picture of this or a picture of that. And so I don't even know how he did it, but I think he just went online and got a picture and figured, who cares? But now they have these essentially web crawlers that are looking for different images. And normally it was, I think most people thought, well, it's a fair use. I'm just sending a little message, but it's because they're able to look for specific things. So I think those kinds of things will happen. I mean, they have, for music, now they have that. Like, if you have like some little snippet of music in an ad, they have these automated systems that are finding those. So I do think that for some of these specific applications, like copyright violations and things like that, I do think that things are going to get a lot better. Where it gets more complicated, as we were saying earlier, is that we live these amalgamated lives. Like, you're a wonderful designer and you use zippers that were in, somebody else invented the zipper. And so that's how we create. We're speaking in the English language. I was listening to a podcast yesterday while I was running by this brilliant neuroscientist, David Eagleman. And he's talking about kind of language, and do languages guide what we're able to think? And I think the answer to that is kind of yes. I mean, I'm very happy to have English as my native language just because there's a lot of words. But we have different concepts. Like, other languages have different concepts and different ways of framing possibility. And I think that's going to be the challenge, and is kind of figure what are the specific areas where we actually do want a lot of regulation. I mean, hate speech is one, copyright infringement is one, just protecting people from abuse. There's all sorts of things. And what are areas where we want to have this kind of bubbling creative commons?
And then what are the areas where you have an opinion about something and somebody else doesn't agree with your opinion? How does that get managed? It's tricky for us now, but I do think AI is going to help us with this neutral party. We can appoint it a neutral party in some form.
I think it could again,
but
I just think that for every time we do it, somebody's going to say, I don't want that as a neutral party. Why is it neutral? What is neutral? And that's why, for me, this will be just an ongoing process. There will never be an arrival point. It's like, now we've got it. It's going to be trial and error and learning. And that's very hard for our government system, because at least the way we're organized now, there'll be like some big push for some legislative agreement. And then it happens, and then people kind of move on. And so the idea of governance is something that happens every day in this dynamic situation. It's moving so much more quickly. And I think it's going to put a lot of stresses on us. And I think it's going to require more of every individual. mean, right now, I think we have this
yeah.
thing in the United States that people are just so fed up and frustrated, and so much of governance is like this crazy charade. And yet I think we're going to have to realize that we live in a common space, and there have to be rules, and those rules are kind of hard rules and soft rules. They're norms, like you were talking about your business and what are the standards of behavior. Part of that is like, I'm sure there's a rule, if you do X, there'll be Y penalty. But part of it is you set a norm of behavior, of how people should interact with each other, and that's every bit as important as whatever the hard rules may be.
So, Jamie, your book, what would you like people to come away with after they read the book? What would you really expect will be the purpose of your book?
Yeah, so this is for my new book, Super Convergence, which is coming out in June of 2024. And what I'm really hoping is people recognize that something huge and fundamental and transformative is happening now. Appreciate that this technology is not something that's happening to you. You are part of this transformation. And if you want to be part of guiding not just where our society goes, but where your life goes, you really need to understand what's happening and what's at stake. You need to start anticipating where things are going. And then you need to recognize, well, what is your role in building the kind of future that you would like to inhabit? And whether that's decisions making in your personal life, in your professional life, how you're interacting with elected officials, is really everything. And that's my burning passion, because I said it before, but I'll say it again. This story is not technology. The story is values. These technologies are incredible manifestations of human creativity. It's astounding what we've been able to do, but there's a real danger that people say, AI will do this, the technology will do this. We are the creators of the technology. The technology now kind of has its own identity, just like we essentially created dogs, but they do their own thing. And we're going to have to kind of coexist and guide and figure things out. But I really want people to feel empowered, because there's a real danger for people to say, oh, now I'm disempowered or I'm irrelevant. I think humans do a lot of crap that we would prefer not to do. And how great if we have technologies that can do things that we don't want to do, so that we can do more things. I was at a wedding this last weekend, and I sat next to a friend of mine who's a wonderful architect. And so he was talking about how these AI-assisted design programs, you can just do a little drawing and it can be built. Yeah. And then it reminded me of Calatrava, this kind of amazing architect who's also a watercolor painter. And for every building he constructs, he'll do thousands of these watercolors until he finds this beautiful design. And so I think we can, coming back to what I was saying before about with co-pilots, with these co-pilots supporting us, we can just dream wonderful dreams. And every person can have more level, like for the work that you do. I mean, you've been at it for so many decades. You have all this infrastructure around you to do all of these things, which empower you and make it possible for you to reach so many people. But just imagine some 21-year-old designer in wherever, Rwanda, who's listening to this podcast. That person, with all these different co-pilots, can dream designs, can have things manufactured, can do all of these things that you had to do by hand, and you learned a lot by doing the thing by hand over these decades. And then it's like generationally, then this is the new starting point. It's like climb a little higher so you can climb a little higher.
It truly is climbing higher for everyone. It really is. I believe this is a very democratic experience we're about to have. I don't think it's divided. I don't think it has to be divided politically. I don't think it has to be divided by wealth and status. We can all use it. And thank you so much. You are so amazing. I can't wait for everybody to hear this and read your book. And your other books are really fun too. I still recommend Hacking Darwin because I think there's just some real good, heavy duty, powerful stuff in there that just holds up. It's so great. And so I'm thrilled to share you with everybody that's listening and will be.
So, Sue, I am, as I said before, I'm your biggest fan, not just for everything that you've done, but for kind of how you live your life. And I just think that if everybody emulates you in their thing, like whatever you're doing, making toast, it doesn't matter. There is a dream. There's like, all right, if I can do this, what's possible? And to imagine what's possible, what do I need to do? I mean, we wouldn't even know each other but for your open aperture. Like you're kind of looking at the world. It's not stalking. It's like you have an open aperture to the world of saying, well, where can inputs come from that I will value? And I just think it's such a wonderful way to live.
You are that person too. I mean, I think I am adventurous. When you spoke about, getting on a plane to Cambodia as a kid and just exploring, I didn't go into Cambodia, but I got on a plane and said, I don't know, I'm going to do this. I'm going to find out what I'm supposed to do in life. I think having that attitude about adventure is really healthy, and I hope more and more people do it. And you are such a great communicator that hearing what you're talking about and listening to it, and actually understanding it because you make it very clear, is going to be such a benefit for people who have any adventure in their soul or have never even thought about it who may now. So thank you.
Share some more microbiome.